All right, guys, let's get into this. Let's talk about steroids and PEDs and how bad everything is and how it's cheating. And I'm going to give you guys some compelling arguments for any of you who have thought about this for literally more than 30 seconds at a time. You're going to realize that this whole argument that you guys have makes no sense. So first, let's start with my journey into PEDs, steroids, yada, yada, yada. And you know why I started initially taking steroids, which I've been open about for years. Number one, because they were legal in Jiu Jitsu. There's no, especially back then in 2016 when I started, there was no organizations in Jiu Jitsu that even tested for PEDs. So they were just like clearly legal. Number two, people don't remember anything other than the fact that you won or lost, right? No one talks about the fact that Khabib missed weight how many times? 6, 7, 8 times. They talk about the fact that Khabib's undefeated. The only thing that people care about is whether you won or whether you lost. They don't care if you were injured. They don't care if you were sick. They don't care if you had a good camp, a bad camp. What everyone cares about when everyone looks back in 10 years is, did this guy win or did this guy lose? That combined with the fact that steroids are legal in Jiu-Jitsu, it kind of made it a no-brainer, number one. Number two, I was always in Gary's weight class. And Gary Tonin, who was my coach at the time, we were both in 77, and I didn't want to compete in ADCC at 77 and have to compete against my coach. I wanted to go up in weight. But I was a big 77 at the time because I walked around at 185, 190. So I was a relatively big 170, but I was a tiny 88 kilogram, which is 194. So I wanted to go up and get out of Gary's weight class. So my first introduction to PEDs, steroids, whatever we're going to call them, steroids, I guess, was after I had won EBI 170. I cut the weight, I did EBI 170, and then after that, I started competing, started going up in weight and getting to a higher weight class. So your whole argument that, oh man, Gordon wouldn't even be good unless unless he was on steroids. Like if he didn't have steroids, he wouldn't even be this good. He wouldn't be dominant. I was submitting ADCC champions and medalists way before I was ever on steroids, while I was natural, while these guys were juiced up. Like natural, I submitted Yuri, I submitted Rustam. Yuri was the reigning ADCC champion at the time. He was 230 pounds when we competed, and I was 185 pounds when we competed. So he outweighed me by almost 50 pounds. Whether he was natural or not, who knows? I was definitely natural. Rustam was the reigning ADCC reigning gold medalist. Then I submitted Keenan, I submitted Wagner, I submitted all of these guys natural, having just gotten my black belt. So I was 5 years into doing jiu-jitsu. I had just gotten my black belt and I was 20 years old, between 180 and 190 pounds natural, and I was submitting all the best guys in the world. And I was a tenth of what I am technically back then. So the argument that, oh, he can only win because he's on steroids is completely false, because I was already beating the best guys in the world natural, having a tenth of the technique and the skills that I have now, 50 pounds lighter against the best guys in the world who are all juiced up and have been training for 4 times as long as I have. So that argument is just completely insane. Then you guys go in to talk about, oh, well, he only has stomach issues because he's been abusing steroids. No, you morons. You know how many other people, everyone else in the sport takes steroids? I'm the only one with stomach issues. How come bodybuilders and all the strongmen don't have debilitating stomach issues? Like the hardest thing in a bodybuilder's job, and the hardest thing for strongmen is the diet. Lifting the weights is easy. Eating food every 2 hours, 6 meals a day, every day, all day, just shoving your face with food. That's the hardest thing for bodybuilders, for strongmen, and for heavyweights in jiu-jitsu, because of the fact that you're training all day. So that will naturally just burn a lot of calories. Bodybuilders take way more steroids than jiu-jitsu guys. So how come all these guys aren't dying from debilitating stomach issues? Like, it just makes no sense, that argument. The reason I have stomach issues is because I had recurring staph infections in 2018, and I was on antibiotics for staph for like 200 days out of the year, and that just completely wiped out my gut biome. That argument just makes zero sense in any capacity, because there's tons of guys that are on steroids that their stomachs are fine and they can eat food all day. For me, it was antibiotics and just being on recurring antibiotics for staph, and then it was like 2 weeks, a week to 2 weeks, depending on how bad the staph infection was, on antibiotics. And then like 2 or 3 days off training, and then 2 weeks antibiotics, and then 2 or 3 days off training, and then so it was like a cycle I got caught in where the antibiotics wiped out my stomach, and then from there my immune system was kind of down, trying to fix the stomach. Because my immune system wasn't as strong as it should be, I got staph again, and then I took more antibiotics, and that destroyed my stomach worse. And then I just got caught in a cycle where it was like my stomach got worse, my immune system got weaker, I kept getting staph, my stomach got worse, my immune system got weaker. So it was like this cycle I couldn't get out of for the longest time. Which for any of you guys who are going through that now in your journey and you just keep getting staph infections, one thing that I did that helped me was not every shower, but every shower that I would have after a jiu-jitsu session, I would use Hibiclens. It's what they use, the soap that they use before they do surgeries, I'm pretty sure. And you can buy it at CVS, Walgreens, you can get it on Amazon, anywhere. They set out to use it after every shower because it does affect the microbiome on your skin, apparently. Like, you can take too much of the good bacteria off because it basically just kills everything. But using it after only jiu-jitsu sessions helped me a lot. So Hibiclens if any of you guys are having the same trouble. That was my spiel on my journey and how you guys just have idiotic arguments. So let's talk about actual jiu-jitsu just in general now, or steroids in general now within jiu-jitsu. Steroids in jiu-jitsu are legal, just like they're legal in bodybuilding. So they're like, oh, Gordon has an asterisk next to his name because he wins and he's on steroids. It's like, no, I'm the only guy who talks about being on steroids because I'm not a fake douchebag like the rest of the guys in the sport who just say that they eat vegetables and acai and take their vitamins. So that's like saying Ronnie Coleman isn't a legitimate bodybuilding champion because he took steroids, like where steroids are legal. It makes absolutely no sense. Steroids are legal in jiu-jitsu. The only place they're not legal is in IBJJF, where they started testing after I had won the Worlds. I won the Nogi Worlds, and they're like, man, we have to make sure Gordon doesn't win again. So then they started testing. So there's certain tournaments, like IBJJF, just the Worlds, I think, and the Nogi Worlds, where they started testing, but I never competed in IBJJF when steroids were legal. I never competed in any event where steroids were illegal, where they said you couldn't take them, or we're going to test for these. Okay, so that's like saying arm bars are legal, but you just shouldn't use them because whatever reason. It's like, if an arm bar is legal, I'm going to use an arm bar. If leg locks are legal, I'm going to use leg locks. Steroids are legal, so why wouldn't you use steroids? The thing with steroids are, do you need steroids to be the best athlete in the world? No, I don't think so. I think that I could have done all this natural, and I could have been the best in the world without steroids. I'm not encouraging you to use steroids. I'm not encouraging kids to, definitely not kids to use steroids. I'm not encouraging any of that. What I'm simply stating is that I don't believe that you need steroids to be the best in the world. What I do believe is that you need steroids to be the best version of yourself as an athlete. Because what steroids are is they're PEDs, performance enhancing drugs. If you are an athlete that's at this level, there is no possible way that if you take steroids, you can be a worse level athlete. Like, steroids are always going to make you a better athlete. So if I was competing against the second best guy in the world, first of all, I would have been bored years ago because everyone's terrible. Second of all, if I was just competing against the second best guy in the world, of course I wouldn't need steroids. I'm so much technically better than everybody else that there's no need to take steroids. I'm not competing against the second best guy in the world. I'm competing against myself. How good can I be as an athlete before I reach my physical prime, or before injuries or this 3-year-old stomach takes me out and I can't compete anymore? So it was never, oh, I'm doing this to beat the best guys in the world. I can beat the best guys in the world natural, and history and statistics and facts have shown that, as I stated previously. So the reason for taking steroids for me was, number one, to get out of Gary's weight class, and number two, to become the best athlete that I could be. Because you simply cannot be, you can be better than the rest of the guys in the world, but you can't be the best athlete that you could possibly be unless you take steroids. And that's just a fact. That's just inherently true. They're performance enhancing drugs. You're always going to be better as an athlete taking steroids than you would be if you weren't taking steroids. So what I think we should do is, instead of, we had Reagan come out with a war on drugs, and America is very against steroids, PEDs, like that, things like this. And ever since Reagan came out with the whole war on drugs, we have this aversion to drugs in general. What I think that we should do is we should do more. Obviously the governments have a lot of research on steroids because they want to make super soldiers and things like this, but there's not a lot of research out there for the general public insofar as steroids. There's just a lot of bro science. You go on a forum or you ask the guy at the gym and they tell you, do this, do that. But there should be more publicly available research on steroids so that athletes could use steroids safely, rather than just, athletes are always going to use steroids. Okay, if you have guys competing for hundreds of thousands, millions, hundreds of millions, some cases, like soccer, billions of dollars, there are always going to be performance enhancers. All right, that's just the truth of it. You have USADA, you have WADA. These are multi-million, maybe hundreds of millions of dollar organizations looking to, come in and catch you doing steroids. But the industry for beating steroid tests is a multi-billion-dollar operation. Like, you have the country of Russia, the country of China, the country of America hiring doctors to beat these tests. So you're always going to have guys that will beat the test. You're always going to have athletes on steroids. So if that's the case, you may as well just come out and do more research on them so that athletes can do them safely. Because athletes are always going to be on PEDs. Do you think just because there's testing in a certain event that guys aren't juiced out of their minds? Like, you must be so naive to think that. Like, you think guys are competing in the NFL, in their late 30s, 40s, with traps from their AC joints up to their ears? Do you think those guys are natural? Are you out of your mind? It's just, you may as well just make it easier for guys to do steroids than to just ban them and have guys do steroids anyway. Because the fact is, when you have testing, especially in a sport like MMA, for example, where the lowest level guys aren't really paid that much money. So you have a guy who just gets to the UFC and he's making 10 and 10, right? Or 12 and 12. 12,000 to show, 12,000 to win. $24,000. You have to go through a whole camp. You got to pay for all the expenses. You got to bring in training partners. You got to pay for your coaches. You got to fly the coaches out sometimes. There's a lot of expenses that go into this. So those guys, if there's steroid testing, those guys won't have the resources or the money to hire the doctors necessary to beat the test. So those guys are natural. The guys at the top who are making millions of dollars, those guys will always have or part of the big teams will always have the resources and money available to them to hire the doctors to help them beat the tests. And the whole purpose of steroid testing is so that you don't have natural athletes competing against unnatural athletes. But you get that anyways, because the guys at the bottom can't afford to or don't have the resources to beat the test, and the guys at the top do have the resources. So then you just end up with guys who are naturally competing against guys who are juiced up anyways. Whereas if you had an agreement where any athlete, if you had more research, so it could be done more safely than it is now, and you had an agreement where all the athletes could take steroids and they have to do it safely, then all the athletes can take an equal amount of steroids, and that way you have guys who are all on juice versus guys who at the top can afford to beat the test and at the bottom can't afford to beat the test. So that's another good argument for why you should be able to use steroids, because regardless of what the rules are, guys are going to be using steroids anyways. In addition to that, the athletes can just compete longer. The lifespan of athletes is very limited. In Jiu Jitsu it's a little bit longer because it's more of an isometric based sport than an explosion based sport. But like in the NFL, it's a very short amount of time that you can compete. The PEDs allow you to recover faster. They allow you to be stronger, to be faster. Ultimately, fans want to see the best athletes in the world. And athletes, if they can use performance enhancers, they can not only be a better athlete. You're watching the NFL because you want to watch the absolute best guys in the world play football at a high level. Okay? That level will be increased if the guys can use performance enhancing drugs. They can also compete longer. So you can see your favorite athlete compete longer, and they can do it healthier because of the fact that they can recover from injuries faster. It's harder for them to get injured on PEDs. These are all just incredible arguments for athletes being able to use performance enhancers in a safe way. So now let's talk about specifically steroids in jiu-jitsu, from organization to organization, right? I understand that some people stand on this moral high ground of they don't want to, they don't want to do steroids because they want to win natural. I respect that. If you're a guy who's competing against a bunch of guys who are on steroids and you want to win natural, I do respect that. I did it for a long time. Most of my career from white to black belt, I've had more years natural in my career than I have on performance enhancers. So I do respect that. But at the same time, it's like, if they're legal, like, why wouldn't you do them? Yeah, you can say, okay, well, I beat these guys and I was natural, but I lost to these guys and I was natural and they were on steroids. Whenever someone wins who's natural, it's, oh, well, I won against this guy on steroids, so I'm better. But then when they lose, it's the excuse of, well, I lost this guy because I was on steroids. And the athletes have to understand, people don't care. When people look back in 10 years, they're not going to remember that argument that you made that you were on steroids, that he was on steroids and you were natural. They're going to remember this guy won and this guy lost. And that's as simple as it is. When people look back on my career, he's a 7-time ADCC champion. That's all they're going to remember. And so I respect people who want to do it natural, but it's like, you can be a better athlete if you do it unnaturally. So it doesn't make sense really to do it naturally. If you're looking to be the best athlete that you can be, and people can make arguments where it's not healthy for you and there's long-term side effects and things like that. I understand that, but at the same time, I am trying, like the Michael Jordan quote, I'm trying to win at all costs. I'm not going to do things where I'm cheating. I'm not going to grease and things like that, but these aren't illegal. So I'm going to do everything I can to be the best athlete that I can be. Even if it were to take 20 years off of my life, I wouldn't regret doing the things that I've done to become the greatest of all time in this sport. Because ultimately, when I die, my legacy is what's going to be remembered. I would rather die with a legacy at 50 years old than just be a normal guy dying at 70 or 80 years old. And that's not a sacrifice that people are willing to make, and that's why they're not Gordon Ryan. So, it's a balance there. Guys, look at Arnold. Arnold's 80 years old. That guy did way more steroids than I did, and that guy's fine. There's tons of guys who are old and did tons more steroids for way longer than me, and they're perfectly healthy. That's kind of a misconception. Like, oh, you're gonna have a heart attack at 35. Well, yeah, tons of people who've never done steroids have heart attacks at 35, 40 years old. And tons of people who have done steroids live until they're 80 years old. So back to what I was originally talking about here, steroids specifically in jiu-jitsu from organization to organization. When you have steroid testing, the entire goal of steroid testing is to make sure that natural athletes don't compete against performance-enhanced athletes, which you're always going to have that competition anyways, but you're trying to mitigate the level of testosterone between athletes, right? If you have an organization, for example, that starts testing for steroids, you have the UFC that tests for steroids and nobody else tests for steroids, right? That means that if I'm athlete A and I compete in the UFC and you're athlete B and you compete in every other organization but the UFC, but I am non-exclusive. That means that if we do random testing, which who's going to pay for that, by the way? We'll get to that in a minute. If I do random testing and I have to be natural all year long and I'm competing in the UFC, and I'm also competing in other events that don't test for steroids, all that does is it makes it so that I'm competing in the UFC and I have to be natural all year round because they're random testing me under their drug testing program. And then athlete B is sauced out of his mind all year round. He's competing at flow, he's competing at one, he's competing at IBJJF, he's competing in ADCC. So that when I have to go face that guy, I'm natural because I have to pass tests for the UFC, and that guy is sauced out of his mind, and then you have natural athletes competing against juiced up athletes anyway. It's like in the IBJJF, when they started testing for steroids, nobody else tested for steroids. So the top athletes just either stopped doing the event altogether, or they were just doing the event, they were getting popped and taking 2-year suspensions, and then they were like 2 to 4 year suspensions, and they're like, oh, well, and then now guys just have stopped doing it. The level of athletes at Worlds and Nogi Worlds since I started testing has drastically diminished. So they essentially ruin their own organization insofar as talent at their biggest events because of the fact that they were drug testing and nobody else was drug testing. So it's like you either need to have an agreement, because there's no one governing body. You either need to have an agreement across the board with all organizations that we are going to test for steroids and they're going to be illegal. Or we're not going to test for steroids and they're going to be legal. Because otherwise, what you have is you have athletes competing in one event where they're tested year round and then competing in other events against other guys who aren't competing under that organization and aren't tested. And then those guys are just going to be sauced out of their minds, and you're going to have natural versus unnatural regardless. Okay? Now, the organizations are never going to agree on one standard, right? They're never going to agree that steroids are illegal or steroids are illegal, right? Now it's mostly everyone's like steroids are legal, and for good reason, which we'll get into in a second. The only way around this is for organizations to start signing athletes exclusively, okay? Because now when you have an athlete signed exclusively, now you have all the athletes signed exclusively that can all be tested, and they can't compete in other organizations, so they don't have the opportunity for natural athletes to compete against enhanced athletes, okay? The problem is that you run into there is, number one, when you have exclusivity in Jiu Jitsu, there are so many Jiu Jitsu events per year that happen that you can take advantage of to grow your brand and make money. So the UFC will have a great market insofar as MMA fans, mostly American MMA fans. Flow grappling will be huge in the Jiu-Jitsu community. One championship will be huge over in Asia to open up that market. So there's a lot of overlap in the markets, but there's slightly different markets that you can take advantage of to build your brand competing in all of these different organizations, as well as the fact that because you're not getting hit in the head, you can compete far more in Jiu-Jitsu than you can compete in mixed martial arts. So if Flow, for example, is doing 6 events a year, but I want to do 2 events a month, that's a drastic change, in competition schedule. And if Flow is only doing 6 events a month, 6 events a year, and they sign me exclusive, now I can't go out and I can't do those other, I can't go into those other markets and compete because of the fact that I'm exclusive to Flow now. So what that means is, if you really want drug testing and you want athletes to be tested, you either need an agreement across the board or you need to sign people exclusive. And to sign people exclusively, where they're losing that extra money, they're losing the opportunity to branch into these other markets, and they're losing this ability to be autonomous throughout these organizations, and essentially instead of being an employee, they're like a contractor. You can do that, but it's going to cost money. Okay, and how much money are these organizations willing to fork out to get these athletes to be exclusive? Who knows? And even if all the organizations agree to do drug testing, the only real drug test that makes sense is random testing, because if it's testing on the day of the event, then you just cycle off properly, and it's like an IQ test rather than an actual steroid test, which is decent at, for the average guy. You need like a doctor to help you beat the test if you're not, if you're trying to get around random testing, right? So even if all the organizations came out and said, hey, we are going to make steroids illegal and we're going to do random testing, who is paying for this? Most of the athletes that compete in these events can't even generate $1,000 for these companies to pay these guys. There's not enough money in Jiu-Jitsu to do you know how much random testing costs? There's not enough. Who's going to pay for all this? You have the top guys in the world, of course. I generate enough money for the UFC or for Flow or for One or for whatever the case is to implement random testing on me throughout the year, and then I can still make them money when I compete. When you have the guys that are lower tier guys, like the guys in the prelims, the guys on the lower part of the main card, these guys don't generate nearly enough revenue for these organizations to justify testing them. They would lose money having these guys compete. Obviously they're paying the guys a little bit because they bring something to the show. If you're paying for these guys to be tested year round by a reputable USADA or a WADA or whatever the case is. You are losing money as an organization for these guys to compete for you. It doesn't make sense business-wise. There's not enough money in jiu-jitsu to actually pay for this. So it's great. Everyone can stand on their moral high ground and say, we need to get rid of steroids, we need to test, we need to do that. Yeah, how about you pay for it? Because these organizations don't have money to pay for it. It doesn't make sense. So that's another thing. And I think the most important thing is, even if the organizations are going to say, even if the main organizations are like, we're going to pay for this, or steroids are going to be illegal, then they have to go and they have to pay for it. Jiu-jitsu just started making money now. There's not enough money in the sport to pay for this. And if you guys thought about this for more than 30 seconds, you would easily come to the same conclusion that I have. So with all these points, it's just like there's not really a good argument to be had yet for steroids in the sport. I mean, they're legal. I know you guys might hate them, but they're legal. Just like leg locks are legal, just like arm bars are legal, just like, they're just legal. I mean, Tiger Woods went out and he got LASIK surgery to improve his vision. That was legal. People were upset about it, but there was no rules against that, so we could see the golf ball be hit further. So I mean, steroids they're legal in jiu-jitsu. They're legal in bodybuilding. So until they're illegal and you're using them, who cares? And you could have this morality thing where, oh, I don't want to use them and I want to be the best natural. That's fine. For me, you're not looking to be the best athlete. You may be looking to be better than the rest of the guys, but you're not looking to be the best athlete that you could possibly be. And to me, that's just you're not willing to do the things necessary to be a Gordon Ryan.
All jokes aside, guys, thank you all so much for the support. I love all of my fans and haters alike, and without you guys, I wouldn't be here. As you guys know, I want to start doing some crazy stuff with the channel, and if you purchase from any of these brands or any of my merch, you'll be massively helping the channel. Thanks to all my supporters and partners for making this possible.